Welcome to Unit 5 in our Latin American Studies course. As you've read, in this unit we'll be looking at issues of land, resources, and the environment. Principally, we'll be thinking about conflicts over the right to use water, as well as the way that the environment has played a role in recent conflicts that have taken place in Latin America. In particular, in the podcasts, we'll be thinking about the case of Colombia and the guerrilla war that had gone on between the FARC and paramilitaries supported by the government for decades until that conflict finally came to an end last year through a negotiated peace. The process of bringing that peace to Colombia is still very much in play, although the FARC has begun to transition into a party, a kind of political social movement rather than a guerrilla organization, which is a very promising sign, and some of the violence has indeed gone down in Colombia. But the struggle that took place between paramilitaries and the FARC took place principally in rural areas where poorer people were trying to eke out their living from the landscape and faced problems with that as they had to come into conflict with these violent groups. So I guess what I'm getting at is there are people who were caught in the middle. It wasn't just as simple as the FARC versus the state versus the paramilitaries versus the whoever, but instead everyday Colombians were also in the middle of the fray, trying to figure out how to best live their lives without damage or the threat of violence or actual violence done to them and their families. You can only imagine how difficult it would be to try to live in that kind of a situation. We'll get a tiny glimpse of that with a silver lining in the Snap Judgment podcast and Radio Ambulante in this unit. This time around, those two podcasts cover the same story. It's just that Snap Judgment is in English and Radio Ambulante is in Spanish with the English language transcript again. We'll also be reading some resources that will help us think about the conflicts over water. The right to water, of course, has been described by many as a basic fundamental human right. However, as governments are trying to deal with neoliberal reforms, they're trying to deal with the pressures put on them by international groups like the World Bank and the IMF or the International Monetary Fund. In order to get loans from those groups, they have to follow the stipulations that are placed on those loans. Often that means cutting social services and running their countries as if they were trying to turn a profit for their investors with the country. And so this has resulted in the case of Cochabamba and Bolivia, and that's one that we'll look at in some detail. It's the one that is the backdrop for the film Even the Rain, if you take the chance to view that one for extra credit. There was a California-based company that bought the rights to the water infrastructure to make improvements to deliver water to the people of that kind of a small city. In the process, though, people's water bills went up astronomically to the extent that they could no longer afford to pay for access to water, and the result was, quite understandably, a lot of peaceful protests that in some cases turned violent. The situation has kind of gone back and forth, but there hasn't been a clear victory for either side because the water companies have been able to legislate, or I should say appeal, to the World Bank and the IMF to try to bail them out in terms of the investment that they had made. And the governments of places like, I almost said Colombia, I meant Bolivia, a lot of people there, politicians who are corrupt, were making a lot of money off of selling off utilities and water and so on. So there are a lot of kind of difficult and complex issues at play, but the bottom line is that everyday people are facing huge hardships because of those decisions and because of those corruptions and complexities. The article that you'll be reading for this unit is a little bit more jargony than some that I like to assign, but it does get at a very important issue of looking at the concept of water citizenship in Peru. And so what the researchers are reporting on there is a situation in Peru in which people from different walks of life, so the everyday folks who need access to water, municipal governments, regional governments, the national government, and water utilities, are all getting together to try to listen to each other. At least that's the intent of the legislation that has been passed in Peru, to try to create a different water culture in which all sides and their needs are taken into account. So that article, although it is a little bit jargony, can give us some hope for maybe a path forward in trying to resolve some of these issues. So I hope that you enjoy working through Unit 5, and I look forward to hearing your thoughts on all